Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our November 23rd session regarding the budget process. I'm Stacey Malcolm, Condominium Manager and Resource and Compliance Officer with CMG. I'm pleased to be your moderator for this session. Joining us today, we have Ian Davidson, President of Condominium Management Group. Ian worked for an accounting firm before moving into the property management industry. He started CMG in the early 90s and has attended over 1,800 board meetings and about 200 annual general meetings. We also have Jerry Dupont, Treasurer at Carleton Condominium Corporation, number 486. Jerry has taught a variety of finance, accounting, and business courses at both Carleton University and University of Ottawa, as well as Algonquin College, and cumulatively served about 9 years on the board of directors for his condominium corporation. Welcome, gentlemen. So that kind of leads us into, our budget process. Now, it's interesting that the Condominium Act doesn't actually specify a time by which the budget needs to be provided to the owners in relation to the fiscal year. Ian, what have you seen in your years and decades of experience in relation to when the budget's sent to owners?
Well, I've been doing this since 1988, and it used to be way back when that budgets actually would be almost after the year end. And why that was happening is because the accounting wasn't very accurate. And so the only way the corporation actually knew where they were was to wait for the audit to happen and then budget from the audit. Now with the accounting process and everything in place, we can do it sooner, before the year end, where the process would be get our monthly financial statements, review them, and then just project to year end to giving our year end numbers and then budgeting from that point. But please remember, when doing that, the sooner you do it prior to your year end, the less accurate your numbers will be, because you've got to project the date from when you're doing your budget to year end for utilities. And that's the big swing in most corporations' cases, whether it be water, hydro, or gas.
Perfect. And Jerry, for your specific corporation, in terms of timing, in terms of presenting it to the owners, what do you typically observe at 486?
I'd like to leave it as late as possible for the reasons that Ian stated. A lot of the information that you need, especially utilities, which for us makes up almost a quarter of our budget, I want the latest numbers. But one comment I'd like to make, the budget is not just one thing that happens once a year. For me, I start doing the budget like 5-6 months beforehand. I keep track of things, and then when it comes time to finalize, this is when I want to wait as late as possible. So we'll talk a little bit more about the process later on. I'll expand on that a little bit more, but essentially wait till as long as I can, realizing that this is not a total surprise. I've done a lot of the work beforehand.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, let's dive right into the process, starting with, when should it begin? So we talked about, the end is it being sent to the condominium owners. When does that process start, Ian?
When the condominium manager is doing it, when I was doing it, I'd prefer to start my process after 60 days before year end. So if it was a December year end, I would do it after I've received my October 31st financial statements. I'd receive my billings in from the utility companies. So I knew what my actual amount going out of the bank would be in November. And from those, I could project to get to where my final point, where I thought I'd be at the end of December 31st. So that would cover my utilities. And as Jerry said, that can make up to a quarter of your expenses. Then I'd look at, as they say, the low-hanging fruit. All my contracts that I know that are basically the fixed costs in the following year, whether it be reserve fund amounts from the reserve fund, landscaping, snow removal, staffing, etc. So do all those, and then I start filling in the blanks. And with the blanks, I mean, that's where we actually have some discretion, whether it comes from the condominium manager or the board, and that's where the input comes in. So that's where we have the flexibility. But sad to say, the amount where we have flexibility can be anywhere from 10 to 15% of our total budget. And that's what we have to play with to actually create what the rates are going to be the next year. That's where this discretion comes in with the board. That's what I think. Jerry, what do you feel on that one?
Well, let me start from the very beginning that I think governs a lot of the decisions we make, and that is, what kind of a board do we have? And on one spectrum, one end, you can think of it as a policy board, and then the other end would be a hands-on board. Once you decide where you're at, then it governs a lot of the future steps. So for me, I would make the argument that we are policy boards. In other words, we don't get into the day-to-day details and nuts and bolts of preparing the budget. If we do that, in my view, we get lost in the weeds. You know, if you go line by line at your board meeting to discuss all of this, then I think you get lost and you miss out on the big picture. So for me, you start off with what board are you? So if you decide you're a policy board, then I will have established a working relationship with the condo manager, and then we proceed from there. So essentially, a condo manager would do the nuts and bolts, zero-based budgeting, what contracts have you have, what are your unit costs, all that kind of stuff. And I would come in with, what policies does the board have? Did it implement? How do you feel about delaying maintenance, for instance? Are you going to put rate reduction ahead of keeping maintenance up? Those kinds of issues are really important. In the past year, for instance, most of us, I would guess that if you had a reserve study done, you had a bit of a shock in your reserve being increased dramatically because higher unit costs, inflation is peaking up here, all those things. So what options do you have for funding the reserve, and what impact does that have on rate? So start with where you're at with your board, and you proceed from there.
We're going to jump into this question, and I apologize if it has already been covered or if it seems like a total shift in our conversation. Jerry, what information do you as a treasurer expect during the budget process from your condominium manager?
Okay, very important point. With the condo manager, I really expect that person to know all about the nuts and bolts of the budget. And I like to think that that person starts from zero-based budgeting, meaning that they start at the unit level. So what contracts have you got in place? Have you got information about the latest unit costs? All those kinds of things. Also, as important here, I do a budget as well, and I use the same spreadsheet as our condo manager does. So when we come to compare notes later on, I expect all that to be in place, and our condo manager has. As Ian says, you guys do that. So that's what I expect. And then from me, it will be the policy nature. What are the options?
With COVID, just think about it as your water. If your corporation pays for water, okay? All of a sudden you think, well, how does that affect? Yes, the city's planning to raise the water rates next year by, let's call it 4.6%, 4.8%. Well, great, good for them. But water is based not only on it's based on price per liter, but the number of liters you actually use, or metric liters. So you've actually got to project or guesstimate how many more cubic meters of water you're going to use to go into next year. Okay. And are people going to continue working from home? Because in the last year, at my office building, the amount of water we've used has dropped dramatically. But that's now everyone working from home. You're paying it on your bill, which comes out of your condo fees. So it's not always easy, and there's a lot of guessing in some of these items on where we go, and we try to do it as educated as possible.
Ian, can you speak a little bit more, just because we're talking about making educated budgeting decisions, can you speak a little bit more about what we're seeing looking forward into 2022? Any insights as far as perhaps CPI, utility increases, things that can give our directors present today some insight and some help?
I don't have very much good news here, guys, ladies and gentlemen. Whether it be the utilities, water sewage up 4.8, hydro saying it's going up 10%, like basically 10% above CPI, so not 15%, but 5.5%, 6%. Gas, they're talking about gas, the amount for natural gas going up enormously. As you've all seen at your board meetings, what it's like to get contractors to work. There's a shortage of everything, and with supply and demand, our demand doesn't decrease, but the supply is being reduced, so prices are going up. Then we see, if anyone's done reserve fund projects this year, just the costs. I remember we get reserve fund studies in, and it was constant to see a 2% increase in the inflation rate for repairs and replacement costs. Well, that's blown out of the water. Anyone who's done it. I own a condo in a unit in a high-rise building, and in that building 5 years ago, the quote for window replacement was $5.5 million. It's now $9.5 million. And that's if we can find someone to do it. It's completely out of our control, 40%, and they're forcing you to possibly change your deductible, help you if you've had a number of claims. We've all seen in the papers about the corporations that have had multiple claims and almost can't get insurance. So it's one thing for the Bank of Canada to say CPI was last month was 4.4, this month is 4.7. They're projecting it to be 5% by the end of this year. But the actual costs on the ground, snow removal, I'm sure you've been hit with, the snow contractors can't get insurance. And if they can, it's doubled and tripled. So those costs flow through to you if you want those contractors. So it's difficult. We're not coming with good news. The idea that the condo fees can stay the same or go up by very small amounts, I'm afraid for the next number, or at least this year, those days are gone. Okay. And remembering that's based on providing the same level of service. Okay. If you're in a high-rise building and you've got a cleaner and a superintendent, et cetera, and they do a certain amount of jobs, well, unless you want to reduce their workload, okay, or reduce the staffing, this is to keep the same level of service, you're looking at increases, I'm afraid, and I can't stop that. Okay. It's back to 75 to 80% of your costs in your budget are fixed that we have no control over. So it's difficult. I look forward to the days where it's more of a stable, but those days aren't here right now, I'm afraid.
Barry, do you have anything to add in relation to increases maybe your corporation is seeing, or the reception of the board to the increases when the budget was recently presented?
Yeah, so well, first of all, Ian, you're such a grim reaper. That's why I'm going to have to call you here.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, I think Ian is right, is we are facing these cost increases. So the question becomes, how do we manage that? It's really non-discretionary in the short term. Maybe you can do something about energy efficiencies in the longer term, but in the short term, Ian is absolutely right. We're going to face this issue. So how do we as a board manage these things is the question. So to me, you take a long-term view. Well, if you could, and this would have started maybe a year or two ago, maybe you could have done something at that time. So let me just mention a couple of things. If you were in a lucky position to have had a surplus last year, then the question becomes, what do you do with a surplus? And I think we're going to talk about that in a little while here. But one of the things that you can do is you can use it to maybe mitigate those cost increases that Ian is talking about. That's one. So, and then on the discretionary side, not much, but is there anything there that you can do? And I'm going to be very careful here to say, whatever you do to try and minimize costs in some areas, make sure you don't do it at the expense of maintenance, because we all know that's going to bite us in the future if we do that. You got to keep maintenance up. So, for instance, landscaping. Is there, some things you can do there? It comes down maybe to basic things like Do you plant flowers? Do you plant perennials? There are things like that that maybe you can think of. Ian mentioned about the staff side. Not a lot of discretion, but maybe there's something you can do there. But look at what you can do. The other thing that we should have, or maybe do have, is we have 3 months of a surplus to protect against cost increases, right? So if you have that going in, you have those 3 months. Maybe you want to dip into that, although be careful, because if you dip into it, can you bring it back up later on? So when I look at all this stuff, I have a metric in mind. I know, for instance, that if I increase costs by about $1,500, that results in a 0.1% increase in rates. So I always really have a close eye on that stuff. So those are the kinds of things you got to do, but essentially it boils down to managing what you have. If you have a surplus, great. If not, you are going to be facing those kinds of increases that Ian is talking about.
Okay, perfect. So in relation to, we're talking about increases, and it's specifically relating to maintenance. We received a question with the registrations, which was, can we increase the amount going to the reserve fund based on the board's decision to start to save more money for a future project? It seems kind of like a funny question considering we're talking about increased operation costs. But in the event that a board is in a position to do this, is this something that they're able to do, Ian?
Absolutely. And everyone, I've seen very, very few boards sit at a board meeting table and say, how can we put more, increase our fees? It just doesn't happen. Everyone's looking at generally, what can we do? Where are flexibility to lower them? So for someone to sit there and say, hey, let's put more in the reserve fund, I think it's great. It absolutely makes sense. Rarely do prices for roof replacement, windows, podium decks, any of this stuff go down. They just don't. Okay. So it's pay me now or pay me later. Okay. So and what it does is soften the blow in the future. I use my example of the window replacements down the road. It makes sense. I like it. It makes everybody's lives easier, but you go to the AGM, and when it comes time to discuss the budget and people start asking, why do our fees go up so much? And you sit there and say, well, we put extra in the reserve fund, which makes sense. Expect a little bit of pushback, I'm afraid, especially with everything else going up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have a question in our Q&A. Is it useful to think of doing energy saving repairs and replacements and looking for government grants and incentives? Ian, I'm going to direct this one to you again.
Absolutely. We are continually monitoring what money is available from whether it be Hydro Ottawa, the province. Haven't seen anything federally in a while. To whether it be upgrade or make the energy equipment more efficient. The big one is LED lighting, and do that and as much. And then you go, well, how do you fund it? Well, you can fund it a number of different ways. It's whether it's not out of your reserve fund, but you fund it basically borrowing off yourself and paying yourself back with the savings you get, which can be substantial. So absolutely, but we'll look at everything that's available. And even if it's an air makeup unit or an HVAC unit for a high-rise building, there's money available for that when it's time. And we'll go and get that as much as possible. Or we use the engineers, because the processes that the government's put in place, it's not easy to get, or just the paperwork, et cetera. But that's typically part of everything. Other one is, which is coming, you may have been faced with, is the car chargers, electric car chargers, that the city is actually giving money out for those, depending what type of chargers are put in, and if it's basically whether you're charging back people for the use of it, whether it's common or not. So yeah, we're on top of that.
Perfect. So I have one more question, and then we're going to circle back and speak more to the process of the preparation of the budget. This question being, what do we do with the year-end deficit or surplus? So Jerry alluded to this question previously. So Jerry, I'm going to give you first crack at it.
Okay. To expand on what Ian said, there are essentially three things you can do with a surplus. Let me talk about a surplus first. As Ian said, you can throw some of that into the reserve, or you can use it to mitigate rate increases, or keep it as a contingency or some as a contingency for future possible cost increases. Just referring to my situation here, last year we were in a good position that we did have a surplus and we transferred some of it to the reserve, and I added a little bit more padding on the utility side. So that really is becoming helpful this year because we're able to do that. So when you have those surpluses like that, don't automatically just say, I'll reduce rates. Think of it a long term a little bit. So you can use it for a combination of things. If you have a deficit, the deficit you got to cover, right? You got to do it through rates or special assessments. So it's not a pleasant situation, but maybe have a plan, 2-3 year plan about how you might do that.
Yeah. The other thing with deficits, your auditor is going to comment on it.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have a deficit, and the auditors, when they're in the office, will actually ask, whether it be to the condo manager or the board, what is your plan? How are you planning to collect this? And what chances are what they're doing is they'll be looking at the current budget to see how you're collecting last year's deficit. And if you're not actively doing things to collect it, they will comment to the board, and because the auditors answer to the unit owners at the AGM. So remember, your goal is to have a zero at the end. It's wonderful to have a contingency and money set aside, but you can't budget for a deficit. If you do, and you've got a deficit of X number of $1,000 at the end of the year, it just means the following year's fees go up to cover that. So they will go up to cover inflation for the year and all the extra costs, plus you've got to cover that deficit, or you special assess for it. And those letters really aren't appreciated when people receive them.
Okay. All right, so we're going to circle back just to speak more to the process itself. Ian, in your experience, is it standard practice for the condominium manager and the treasurer to have kind of a preliminary meeting to review the draft before it's presented, whether it be by the condominium manager or the treasurer, before it's presented to the entire board for review and approval?
That really depends on the individual condo corporations and the makeup of the board of directors. As Jerry has said, obviously very strong and a background in finance, that no problem. A lot of corporations simply just don't have that luxury. And it's put onto the property manager, the condominium manager, to do it. So it may be the treasurer and the condominium manager will sit down and look at and kick around a first draft, or it may just be the first draft goes to the board and everybody's all hands on deck to look at it at the same time. So it really depends on the makeup of your treasurer, and each board of directors is different how they like to handle it. And we've got over the 400 condo corporations. They're different, and everyone wants different things. So it really depends. You as the board get to decide which way you'd like to do it. But it's an absolute luxury to have someone on the board with the finance and the expertise of Jerry as an example. It gives it so much more credibility, and it's not the people who are like, it's easy for me to say, okay, fees are going up. I'm not the one taking the pain on it. But while Jerry, on the other hand, is, yeah, the fees are going up and he's in the boat with you. So.
Jerry, do you have any advice or insight for treasurers who maybe don't have as much in the way of experience as you do in terms of maybe that preliminary meeting with their condominium manager?
Yeah, a couple of things I would say there. I think the first step would be, if you're a new treasurer coming on or existing, establish a good working relationship with your condo manager. I think that's really important. I really detest having to go through a budget line by line at a board meeting. To me, it takes us away from the big picture. I really would try and to convince you not to do that. So not to do that is establish a good working relationship with your condo manager, understand what's in the budget if you can. and develop your own spreadsheet based on what the condo manager produces each year that goes to the condo owners. Then you're singing from the same song sheet, so to speak. So it's really important to do that. Then talk about your board, talk to your board about the process, the budget process, and how you'd like to go about it. Explain how you're going to do it. And if you want, for me, I like to leave the budget decision to the very last meeting before we have to send the notice out to the owners, because that gives me the most opportunity, and the condo manager most opportunity to keep to update our costs, for instance, utilities. So it's really important to do that. The board needs to understand where you're going to come from. Also, as a treasurer, you don't want to be a dictator. You have other members on your team. So to me, I try to achieve that by offering options. So you examine, so my presentation to the board would be, here are the changes, the policy changes. They would not be line by line, it would just be that. And then they would be options. And we do have options. So you present those options to the board, and usually that goes pretty well when you follow that. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you so much. We received Q&A in the chat a little bit earlier, and I'm going to ask both of you gentlemen for maybe some insight or assistance. So this director, their corporation has a finance committee as outlined in their corporation bylaws, and they want to look at the details of the spending, which makes things more complicated. Ian, we'll start with you. Do you have any advice or insight on how that process can be undertaken by the board to assist with the process of having a finance committee?
If you have a finance committee, great. It's the condominium management company or the manager's role just to provide them all the information, remembering that the finance committee typically doesn't make decisions they're not the board of directors. The board of directors will, in essence, manage the common elements and the expenses for it. The finance committee kind of looks at it afterwards and just making sure that the expenses are appropriate, accounted for properly, and that committee can then make recommendations on, they may look at, okay, they've looked at, for example, water rates. This is what we think it can move forward with, et cetera. So they would work and advise and really almost take the place of a strong treasurer, which is absolutely fine. And then again, it gives more credibility to the numbers that the board actually has to hand out to the unit owners. Because if you've got a committee there, they've spent their time doing it, which is wonderful.
Okay, Jerry, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I have to declare my bias, I guess, I shy away from that if I can. I can understand it, as Ian said, if you wanted to have a special look at something like water rates or electricity rates or something like that. But I think it stretches out the budget process if you're going to do that, because you are going to get into details. And my view is that the board is a policy board. The details should be put together by the condo manager. Doesn't mean to say you don't ever check on the condo manager. We have a chance to do that at every monthly board meeting that you have. And I could certainly ask questions as we go through the process between me and the condo manager. So from the basis that we're a policy board, I shy away from it for those kinds of reasons.
Okay. All right, so Jerry, back to you. In terms of, so you typically are the one that presents the budget to your board after meeting with your condominium manager. What is the most common question or feedback that you get from your fellow directors when you're talking about the budget?
If I present it properly and I address the policy issues, for instance, I addressed the decisions we made in the past year about whatever, some maintenance issues or whatever. If I address those things, then we end up discussing options at the end. So it goes pretty smoothly. I've never seen a particular question about, certainly not in the details. I don't get a question on details, but it could be on the options. Like for instance, for us, we had a reserve study last year, the comprehensive one, the 6-year one. So, and we had to increase our contributions to the reserve significantly. So it became an issue of, well, how do we do that? Do we stretch it over 3 years? In which case it means certain rate increases, or do you stretch it longer? Do you have a special assessment? So it was a really good discussion about those kinds of real options. So that's what I really enjoyed doing. And I think our board probably appreciated that kind of approach.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Ian, from the perspective of a condominium manager presenting a budget, what do we hear from boards?
It's typically the first thing that comes out of everybody's mouth is my condo fees are too high. And I get it. And what will happen is I would sit there with the board or the treasurer, and what can we do to reduce the fees? Where do we have flex? And I'm going to split board members into two categories. One, the board members that have been through the process before, and two, the board members that it's their first time in the process. And where we get the most interesting conversations is the board members that have gone through the process. This is their first time, and it's like, okay, well, fees are too high. What can we do to change it? Where's our flex? Well, we then have to, or I have to explain to those board members, every board in the history of your condo corporation has had the same thing. So any of the fat has been trimmed. There are very few corporations where there's lots of fat lying around that it's easy picking a low-hanging fruit. It just doesn't happen anymore. So it's more of, and once everyone's at the process that, okay, there isn't a lot of room left to go, where do we go from here? And then you get into the very, very difficult conversation of changing the levels of service. And that's really not at a budget meeting that those decisions should be made. That would happen, as Jerry said, over the year on what we can do. And the budget process, or the budget meeting, is just the review of those decisions from the last year. It's not to be made at, okay, we're going to reduce this by 10% and this by 10%. And it's like, whoa, the ramifications of that are pretty wide. So that would be the really, but any board members that have been through one or two meetings, they'll have gone through it and seen that, yes, any of the fat's been cut already. So what can we do? And go from there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we've talked a lot about the budget itself, the line items, the expenses, and how they affect the revenue. What other information should be included with the budget package to the owners beyond the outline of those expenses? And Ian, I'm going to start with you again.
Okay, I was going to put it to Jerry first.
Okay, we can do that.
One.
All right. Well, to me, you do other things first before you get to that stage. And that is, the budget package is a lot more than just numbers. You should use it as a communication device. And managing expectations is really important. And by that, I mean the owners should know much before the budget is presented what the situation that the condo is really faced with. You can do that in a number of things, in a number of ways. At the AGM, for instance, the treasurer can certainly talk about the pressures that are being felt. So for now, for instance, we all know about inflation, what that's doing to us. We all know about coming out of COVID, what that's doing. We all know about the reserve, if you had one recently, about what's happening there. So you can start managing expectations by sharing that. And then you have other means. Like, for instance, if you have a newsletter, you can have a portion of your newsletter where you discuss those finances. So when you come to the budget and you issue the bad news about rate increases, it's not a total surprise. People sort of expect where you're coming from, and I think, from my experience, people do expect that. As long as you don't say, "Oh, gotta increase rates by 10%," and you don't provide a rationale other when inflation is higher and costs are higher, it's got to be more than that. It's got to be a total communication package. So, Ian, what do you think of that?
Yeah, completely agree. It's back to communication. If you can preempt at the AGM, for example, which is 6 months into your year, or no later than 6 months into your year, let people know what's going on in the meantime, and explain to people. It's like, and water is an example with people working from home, that your actual water usage has increased. And so guess what? Our water costs for the corporation are going to be going up more than just cost of living. And this is why, because it's based on usage. So you've got a chance at the annual general meeting to speak to it, newsletters, etc. And what you can also do is in the actual budget package, provide budget notes to let people know actually where your money's being spent and why. Okay, whether it be landscaping, snow removal, etc. Just so it's not just block numbers that put in place. So it's the more information you give, really the less questions the condo manager has, the less not nasty things that are said to a board of directors, but people understand, and especially as the board are paying the fees also. So you go there, it's back to communication, and just make sure those notes are clear and just hit the highlights of it, and where the actual big changes are, and explain them. The better explained, the easier everyone's job is moving forward.
I can just add one more thing to that, Stacy.
Absolutely.
I think from a treasurer standpoint, the communication with the board is really important. So for instance, when the board discusses various options, say to do a certain amount of work or a contract or whatever, it's important for the treasurer to say, okay, here are the impacts of that on rates. So for instance, you can say if it increases cost by whatever, it means that's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% increase in rates, so that the board knows throughout the year what the impact on rates are. I mean, they know it's going to impact, but if it can be more specific, I think it helps as well.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you both. Your focus on ensuring that the ownership are aware of where those increases and those expenses are coming from. I am just going to add that a fee schedule or an outline of what the new condo fee should always also be included with the budget. So we're just running short of time. We have a couple minutes left. So gentlemen, and Jerry, I'm going to pass it off to you to start us off with your key takeaways from today's session and any advice, 1 or 2 lines of advice that you have, like I said, for those new directors or new treasurers to boards.
All right. Well, I've just talked about communications. That's number 1. That's key. Policy board is really important. So respect the role of the condo manager, respect the role of the board, each side respect that. I'm going to give you a couple of tips. If you can at all, add some contingencies in your budget here and there. If you have a surplus at the end of the year, do add some contingencies. For instance, if you can add 0.1% in rates instead of 5.1, it's going to be 5.2. Well, that adds $1,500. Maybe that you can put as a contingency to utilities. So if you can do that, if you can, that's fantastic. I hate surprising the downside. It really helps.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jerry. And Ian, your key takeaways and advice for our directors.
Yeah, to reiterate what Jerry's just said, don't get caught into reducing your budget expenses for the year, because it comes back and bites you every time. If you're part of the budget process on the board, remember, you're going to be the one living with that budget. Okay. So if you're 3 months in and all of a sudden you've used your repair and maintenance budget, what do we tell the unit owner that calls up and says, this is broken, that's broken? We can't tell them, oh, there's no money in the budget left. Remember, what's the reason for the board of directors in the condo corporation is to maintain and repair the common elements of your condo corporation. So it doesn't say if you can afford it or if there's money. That money has to be spent. Okay. And what we do is, if I'm afraid we overspend, that has to be collected in either a special assessment or a bigger increase the following year, which you don't want to do. So it's typical. Try to level out the fees as much as possible, and whether it be, it's better to have a 4 and 4 than a 0 and an 8% increase, or a 0 and 9. So just be cognizant. This is a long-term play, I'm afraid, and not just a one-off.
Okay. Excellent. So we just have one last question in the Q&A. We're just a minute over, so I do apologize. Can a small condominium corporation with 16 doors operate without a property manager? And if it is the case, does CMG provide support resources to condominium corporations that would like to proceed with these services in-house? Please advise, Ian.
Okay.
And again, bear in mind, we're at the end here.
Yes, actually we do. What we've started is a new operation. It's called Condo Office Solutions. We've looked at the condos that really the board of directors have decided to take on the role of doing it, a lot of it themselves. But what we provide is doing all the accounting, collecting the condominium fees, preparing the checks. It's really web-based. And we provide all the documentation that's required by the province of Ontario. So if you looked COS Condo Office Solutions, it's web-based, and it's really going, what we found was clients would, or prospective clients would call us and we said, well, we can't offer you any services, you're on your own, because everything was modeled after providing a property manager. This, or a condominium manager. This way, we can provide all the services that are required, and the board takes on a much more day-to-day role of acting for that. So if we're more than available for that, and there is a cost savings, a significant cost savings, because you don't need that person acting as your condo manager. You've got the board really takes on that call. But what we also do is provide a consulting service for any questions, et cetera, and any forms, for example, standard contracts, et cetera. It's part of the service. So yes, for the smaller corporations that really don't need that person at a board meeting with them, we provide that, and more than happy to help you out.
Perfect. So inquiries can be made if you have a very small corporation and this is a service that you're interested in.
Absolutely.
All right, perfect. So I apologize, we did run over a few minutes. I'd like to thank Ian Davidson and Jerry Dupont for their time today, as well as all of you that were able to join us this afternoon. Join us next week. We'll be having a discussion on the financial audit with Tuan Lee of Ousley Hanvey Clipsham Deep LLP. The conversation will take us from appointment or reappointment at the AGM all the way to the audit presentation at the corporation's subsequent AGM, including their process and information on all those forms your condominium manager provides for signature during the audit process. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thanks.
Thank you.